Welcome to Free Kiwis. We are very honoured today to be joined by Jonathan Rauch. Now, Jonathan Rauch is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, and he is the author of 8 books, including The Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, that was in 1993, Gay Marriage, Why It Is Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America, that was 2004, and a much more recent book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defence of Truth, from 2021. He's also written many articles on public policy, culture and government. He's an advocate of free speech as a means of approaching truth and is visiting New Zealand as a guest of the Free Speech Union. Welcome to Free Kiwis, Jonathan.
I'm happy to be an honorary Free Kiwi.
Well, I thought we'd start with talking a little bit about your more recent book, The Constitution of Knowledge. And one of the things that strikes me about that really accorded with some work that I've done with my co-host James is that knowledge emerges from a certain kind of social process, that it's not academics sitting in their ivory towers dreaming up the best ideas, but actually open discussion and criticism of ideas that tests those ideas, as I say, as a social process. And I'd like to quote something from the Constitution of Knowledge because I think it captures that really well. And that is that the reality-based community is the social network which adheres to liberal science's rules and norms, objectivity, factuality, rationality. They live not just within individuals' minds and practices, but on the network. So if we think about the network as being the communication between individuals, then clearly to have an open network is the best way of transmitting information around, and anything that gets in the way of the transmission of information and ideas is going to disrupt the process of approaching truth. Do you want to comment on that idea and what your thinking was about that and where it came from?
Oh, that's a big question, what it is and where it came from. So I studied history of science as an undergraduate years ago and became fascinated and wrote a thesis on the invention of the science of geology, which was done by a discrete group of people. We know who they are and they have names and they wrote a lot about it, who set about trying to solve a social problem, which is that people couldn't decide the origin of the earth or how old it was. Some people said that the earth originated in a great flood, as in the Bible, and others, called volcanists, suggested that it originated through the work of volcanoes. And they went at it hammer and tong. It became like a religious warfare. They just dug into each other, and they would steal each other's samples and insult each other in the press and the plays. And some people came along and said, this is the late 18th century. They said, look, enough of this. Let's do things differently. Let's everybody go out and look for samples of rocks, of fossils. Let's map all the stratigraphy of England, which is where this was taking place. And they deliberately created a social network of individuals collecting a lot of detail and information, writing about it, and exchanging it with each other over a network that was coordinated through some professional societies. The Royal Society was one of them. And they did this very self-consciously because they understood if instead of sitting around talking about theories, which they had no way to test, and digging themselves into irreconcilable positions, if instead of that, they accumulated data, checked each other's data, they believed they could build a theory that way from the ground up, and they did. And 50 years after they began that process, we had something very much like modern geology. And we had a much better idea how old the earth was. And most important, we had social peace. In field after field, that's how science was invented. It was invented to solve the social problem of being unable to come to conclusions about truth. And doing that by, instead of having one individual try to impose views on another, having a network of critical exchange and looking for each other's errors, subjecting ourselves to criticism. And then it turns out that where knowledge lives in human society is not in anyone's brain. It's far, far too great for that. It lives on this network of investigators and their institutions And that's where it grows. It's by far humanity's greatest product, objective knowledge, and far, far bigger than any group of individuals could possibly be. And if every human were destroyed tomorrow and aliens came here in 1,000 years, they could decode our libraries and our databases, and they would be able to reconstitute all of this objective knowledge even without us. So it's a fantastic thing.
It is indeed. And it's interesting, isn't it, and no accident, that at the same time as modern science was constituting itself in that way, so in the political realm, the idea of democracy was growing. And surely that's founded on a similar principle, that political decisions are better when there is open discourse within a society and ideas can be contested and everybody gets a say in who is governing.
Exactly. And you can add to that, although we've had exchange, of course, since the beginning of human affairs, this is also the period when we see Adam Smith codify the theories of exchange and how markets can operate in sophisticated fashions without any coordination, but the knowledge in the market resides in the market. It's in the prices. You and I don't understand why the price is what it is, but the market knows. And this concept, this revolutionary social idea that we're talking about is, in a word, liberalism.
Yeah.
By which I don't mean in the American sense of left-wing progressivism. I mean in the sense that after many generations of conflict and war and oppression and schism and ignorance and poverty, people said, let's try something else. Let's have systems that are governed by rules instead of rulers. And let's have impersonal networks and rules like voting in a democracy and exchange in a market economy and empiricism in science, people checking each other to find out who's right. And then let's leave it up to the emergence of what comes out of those rules to settle the issue.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that interests me about this book is that it's not just, as I understand it, a matter of networks and collaboration and free thought. It's also a matter of these things being structured in a certain way. So your analogy is the U.S. Constitution, which sort of famously has all these veto points and has sort of means whereby ambition can counteract ambition. And, you know, it has all these other features that, as I say, sort of structure the conversation. So that's an idea that you also think will work for truth as well, will work in the sort of epistemic domain. Isn't that correct?
Yes. So I've written 2 books about this. One was 31 years ago, Kindly Inquisitors. And what it's about is this liberal knowledge network. But the model I had at the time, it's a good model. I don't disown it by any means, but it's about basically individuals communicating with each other, criticizing each other in a kind of big network of mutual criticism. It's based on the work of the philosopher Karl Popper. I realized over time, but especially after 2015, 2016, when we saw the rise of some developments in social media and politics that were really devastating our ability to come to conclusions about a common reality. People began saying things like, well, you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts. I thought, what's going on here? And after listening to a lecture by Jonathan Haidt, who is, I think, a friend of this institute, John said something really interesting, which he says, making a liberal democracy work is all about getting the settings right. And there's really only a narrow band of settings that will work. And if those get out of kilter, the whole thing can collapse pretty quickly. And that made a light bulb go on. And I thought, okay, it's got to be more than just unstructured critical exchange, because that's just chaos. That's just Twitter. There has to be structure. There have to be settings that regulate how we organize these conversations so that they lead us to knowledge, so that they incentivize productive work and not, for example, trolling, ad hominem attacks, posturing, and so forth. And over time, I realized that we have a system for doing this. I call it the Constitution of Knowledge. This is not a metaphor or a simile or a figure of speech. There really is a Constitution of Knowledge. It's written down in a lot of places. And things like journalistic ethics codes and the American Association of University Professors Red Book, which sets out standards for academic conduct. But what it has is a common theory with the U.S. Constitution, or for that matter, the British Constitution, and that is that it forces compromise. It says that in order to make knowledge, you can't dominate others, you have to persuade them. So you enter a process of negotiation where I propound a hypothesis, and you, in a very structured, specific way, I'll lay it out according to certain rules. You'll look at it, you'll say, well, here's some counter evidence. And then the third person, James over here, will say you're both wrong. But you need a lot of structure to do that, and you need a lot of institutions like universities and journals and peer review and years of inculcation in these practices to get this right. And that's what the Constitution of Knowledge is. Those are those rules.
And those of us who went to university a few decades ago were well versed in that, because that was how the universities, by and large, were operating through the 20th century.
Yes, that's right. And the same is true of journalism, which is also part of the Constitution of Knowledge.
And we might
the law.
reflect on the law and various other elements of that Constitution of Knowledge. And
yes, all are following very specific structured social rules in order to come to truth.
And we might observe that the 200 or so years during which the Constitution of Knowledge has risen and been ascendant have been the most prosperous and the most knowledge productive in human history by orders of magnitude.
Orders of magnitude.
Not just a little bit, but vastly, massively more.
This is humans' most successful, more transformational technology, because I believe, I can't prove this, but I think I can say confidently that today humanity produces more new knowledge on any given morning than in its first 200,000 years of existence. And that's because we've hooked up this global network of millions of minds and thousands of institutions in a constant rolling process of comparing and contrasting ideas and sorting and filtering to figure out on any given day what most closely approximates truth. And that's why COVID-19 was identified. Within a weekend, its genome was decoded, and within another weekend, a vaccine was designed. Absolutely incredible what this system can do.
And also economically, we've seen the greatest rise in prosperity in history from a situation in which most people were illiterate and poor and living hand to mouth in every country of the world.
Yes, until the Industrial Revolution, the average amount of per capita GDP growth, gross domestic product, for the first, 100 to 200,000 years was approximately zero. Yeah. And then it skyrockets.
Interestingly, James gave us a talk on this issue, being a scholar of ancient Greece, and studied the ancient Greek economy and showed just that the rate of growth was minuscule.
Yeah, and there are these periods in human history where you do get some sustained growth. Like some people have argued that this is the case in ancient Greece. You get sort of 0.1% growth over a period of 700 or 800 years, which is, over that period of time, it's quite transformative. But there again, it's interesting that when you do get these moments in global economic and intellectual history, when you get these, miracles, or Jack Goldstone calls them efflorescences, you could argue that they're produced by the same rules, actually, because if you look at the ancient Greek economy and the ancient Greek kind of constitution of knowledge, it has similar features, right? It has competition, it has openness, a certain measure of freedom of speech, at least in the democracies. And so in some ways, what we've done in the modern period is kind of managed to bring all of those good things together in a stable way, and at least in some countries initially, and then that sort of spread outward from there.
Yes, though we've taken it much, much further. We've added a magic ingredient, which is institutions. And that's something I emphasize in the Constitution of Knowledge that I missed in the first book, Kindly Inquisitors. Most of us in the knowledge building industries don't directly communicate with each other, except maybe in the hallway or sometimes at a conference. Most of what we're communicating through are institutions, labs, universities, journals, newsrooms, editors, and those are the accumulators of knowledge. They do the sorting, they do the comparisons, they also do the training. They become the repositories of the professional standards of, there are right ways and wrong ways to do law, to do journalism. They train the next generation. And that's the magic ingredient, which I think the ancients did not have, building those institutions. And once you've got those in place, once you've got the Royal Society in the 1800s, and then you can begin to build an accumulation of knowledge and practices and pass those down through generations and not get wiped out when there's a regime change.
The question to me is, have those institutions started to become corrupt? Now, first of all, I'd like to reflect on what it takes to have the constitution of knowledge. You observed that really it's the first time in human history those institutions had come together in quite that way, and we've seen the results and reflected on that. But it seems to me that to put those institutions together runs counter to a whole lot of things that humans are like in their kind of natural state. We are combative towards one another. We like to be right. We like to accumulate power. We like to be in charge or not to be dominated by others. So there's this kind of conflict built into us of a non-discursive type, shall we say, which manifests as violence and war. And we're greedy. We want to accumulate resources for ourselves. And somehow we got to the point where we were able to build those institutions in spite of all of that. But my contention is that it's always precarious, because those baser aspects of humanity tend to make a resurgence if the values that underpin the constitution of knowledge are not properly maintained. And my contention is that we've dropped the ball on that, and I'd be interested in your views on whether we have. But you have talked about this idea of the spiral of silence, which I believe was a term coined by Elisabeth Noel Neumann, who was a German political scientist. And it's this idea that people don't like to stand out as having a disagreement with the majority, and so if they perceive the majority to think differently to them, they'll either silence themselves or fall into line. And it was demonstrated aptly by Solomon Asch's experiment in the 1950s, and Asch was a social psychologist, and he ran an experiment where he had several Confederates who pretended to be participants in the experiment and only one real participant. And he was saying, what we're doing here is an experiment in visual perception, and I want you to judge the lengths of these lines. Are they the same or different? And he had the Confederates give blatantly wrong answers. And when all of the Confederates gave the same wrong answer, the real participant would tend to fall into line and defy the evidence of his own senses and say what the rest had said. But if there was even one dissenter, then amongst the Confederates, then the likelihood that the real participant would fall into line dropped dramatically. So I think that's a very good illustration of that idea of the spiral of silence. And it seems to me that our institutions now are too often transmitting ideas that are counter to the constitution of knowledge. And so I worry that the whole thing is falling into disrepair. So I've said a lot there. I'd like to get your reflections on that.
Well, it's a worry. Now, the constitution of knowledge, like the U.S. Constitution, is not self-enforcing. It requires a lot of people, especially the professionals who act as its executors, to maintain a lot of very specific norms and institutions. In the case of the United States Constitution, it requires that multiple branches of government behave in certain ways. It requires that the courts be independent and not corrupt. It requires that the losers of elections concede that they have lost the election. It requires that members of the system, for example, politicians, not go on wholesale lying sprees to retain office once they've lost it. The founders of the U.S. Constitution warned that it's not self-sustaining. They said it rests on the civic virtue of the people. And if they become corrupt, there's nothing that can uphold the Constitution. It becomes a mere parchment. And on the side of the political Constitution, as many of your audience, I'm sure, know, we are in a real battle about its sustainability in the United States right now. And depending on the outcome of the next election, we could see some deeply, deeply serious blows to that Constitution. So now over to the one that you asked about. By analogy, what researchers do in academia is not enforced by law. No one gets thrown into jail if they make up citations. No one gets thrown into jail if they're wrong. It's okay to be wrong. That happens.
We should embrace it even as scholars.
We should embrace it, but you got to be wrong in good faith, and you've got to be willing to correct your errors. What happens if people inside the system begin violating those rules? For example, you're supposed to follow where the evidence leads and put politics aside. What if some people come along and say, well, you know, what we're really doing here in this laboratory is fighting colonialism. So we're going to have decolonial science. We'll report only the results that match our mission. Or what if you begin to say medical professionals, say in psychology, say, well, the goal here is not to alleviate mental illness. The goal is to decolonize our patients so that they'll be less racist. Mm-hmm. What happens if journals say, as one scientific journal did a little under 2 years ago, from now on, we reserve the right not to publish papers that we believe will harm minorities in some broader social sense. And we'll retract papers that we think cause social damage to minorities.
Irrespective of their scientific merit.
Irrespective of whether they're true or false, irrespective of how important they are, irrespective of anything else. This is the journal Nature Human Behavior announced this. Once that happens, they're not doing science. They're doing politics.
Yeah.
And there's no way to prevent that from happening except on the honor and integrity of the people in the system. So the aforementioned Jonathan Haidt, for example, his name keeps coming up, but he's influenced my thinking, withdrew from the Professional Association of American Psychologists. I think that's who they are, because they began demanding political statements of people who were submitting papers, so-called DEI statements. They said, you've got to tell us how this will advance the cause of minority rights and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he said, that's not science, and we'll have no part of it. So we are seeing this steady incursion of politics into the realm of science, broadly defined, especially the humanities and the social sciences. Now, I am not a doomsayer. These rules and norms of the Constitution of Knowledge are hard fought and hard won and have been around for a very long time. There is still a lot of integrity in the system. There are millions of dedicated scholars around the world trying to do the best work they possibly can, and some of them are pushing back at some personal cost against efforts to instill anti-racism, for example, as the North Star of science. But not enough, at least not yet. And much more needs to be done, I think, to restore the norms that we depend on if we're going to advance knowledge and, by the way, justice.
Yeah.
You can't have justice in a world without knowledge.
When we say something needs to be done, though, as you say, the founders of the American Constitution recognized that if the civis fell into disrepair in terms of its integrity and willingness to uphold the Constitution of Knowledge, it would fail.
The U.S. Constitution in that case, yes.
Yes, in that case, but I would say that a similar malady is playing out not only in America but certainly throughout the Anglosphere. Certainly
that's right.
Here
we've seen
in New Zealand.
We've seen the establishment of sacred cows.
That's right.
Which cannot be researched, and conclusions of only certain kinds will be accepted by a large number of people. We've seen chilling We've seen free speech violations at these institutions. That's not new. What are new are cancel campaigns. This is something that grew out of the ease with which people discovered they could use social media to essentially mob people who have heretical views and attempt to drive them from their jobs.
It's a great way to amplify the spiral of silence, right?
Exactly. Well, this is a big theme of the Constitution of Knowledge, is it's very easy to exploit the cognitive shortcomings of the human brain. You're an expert in that, Michael. You're a cognitive scientist. So you know that we don't perceive reality through our eyes. We perceive reality through our tribes. And if you can manipulate what people think the people around them believe, you can manipulate those people's beliefs. So you create a false consensus. If you can manipulate social media and, for example, rules on campus, so that it looks like everyone believes Proposition X, you can convince a lot of people to go along with that proposition just so that they won't stick out and be the odd person out. So you create a false consensus.
Yeah.
And this is a very sophisticated form of cognitive warfare.
Yes.
Goes back a long time. And it turns out social media is very well adapted to waging it.
It's almost, though, I mean, in some ways it's different than what we saw, for example, in Germany in the 1930s or in the Soviet Union, where there was a totalitarian authority directing the distortion of the perception of public opinion. Now it's almost its own network that, again, nobody is necessarily driving, but it operates on this social basis where these mobs constitute themselves on Twitter or whatever platform and go for people who say the wrong thing.
And something that could be seemingly quite random, a bad joke by someone could attract attention, go viral, and suddenly a mob descends, not for any particular reason. That's one way of doing it, but a lot of these attacks are quite specifically targeted. You know, for instance, graduate students will say that James over here published a racist paper and this is outrageous, let's go after him, get his job, and then they will.
Well, it's interesting, actually. The example I was thinking of is in classics, there still is this private organization called the Kindly Institute, which leads groups of students around Greece and Italy, and teaches them about the classics. And there was a cancellation campaign against the two leaders. One of them has since sort of lost that job, the two leaders of this organization. And one of the reasons that they tried to cancel him, and actually succeeded in canceling one of them, was because he'd said at some point something along the lines of, well, a lot of people died in Caesar's Gallic campaigns. However, after that, there was a period of stability under Augustus. And the person who made the complaint, there's a huge list of online complaints, put in all caps, "This literally justifies genocide," right? Which I think is a sort of absurd idea, that someone who says, oh, Caesar killed a lot of people, but then there was stability, is going to go out and become a genocidaire, or even justify, what Hitler did or whoever. But what's astounding about these things in the sort of early days of this was that you'd see sort of, I remember reading this online and thinking, okay, well, obviously there are all these senior professors in the field and all these powerful departments of classics, and they're all going to come out and they're going to put out statements defending the Kindly Institute. And in fact, what you got was the opposite, that they all denounced the Kindly Institute. And I'm still really flabbergasted by this, but it must be, as you say, that initially on X or Twitter as it was, all the signaling was being done from one side, right? And so everybody got this sense of, oh, the radicals are in control. And sometimes when I'm more optimistic, I think like X now is very different. And I wonder whether it's just a matter of the sort of first mover thing, that the radical progressives were the first people to go on social media and really make it their own. And even though there's more back and forth now, and it can get a bit tetchy as an understatement, things might actually get better because now there's more people on different sides of the political spectrum.
I think they'll get worse. So we haven't talked about another form of cognitive manipulation, cognitive warfare, as it's called, and that's practiced by the right. So illiberal people, people who are trying to force their own agenda, are on the left and the right, and they use different weapons, and the left tends to use its cultural supremacy in order to inflict damage to reputation and career on those it disagrees with, and in order to manipulate opinion so it appears a lot more people agree with them than actually do, and all of the stuff you've been talking about. The right in the United States uses a different set of cognitive warfare tools. There are a bunch of them, like repetition, and that's saying the same falsehood again and again and again. Even refuting it makes it sink deeper into the brain. Or reversal, that's I'm not the puppet, you're the puppet, whatever's said about me, I say about you. People throw up their hands. Possibly the most important for our current purposes is what's called the fire hose of falsehood. This is a technique that was perfected by the Russians. We saw it in the Tsarist days. It was very commonly used by the KGB, and Vladimir Putin is a master of it. And this is where you pump out so many lies, half-truths, conspiracy theories, and exaggerations over so many channels at such a rapid rate with no attention to underlying reality that you just confuse people. You make them throw up their hands. They don't know what's true or false anymore or what the difference really is. And every time some journalist or fact checker knocks down one of these things, the propagators have already gone on to 5 more.
Sounds a bit like a certain American politician as well.
Well, we're coming to that. This technique was described by Stephen Bannon, a close aide to Donald Trump, a strategist, as flood the zone with shit, which is a very good description. Well, it turns out that the greatest practitioner of these tactics in modern times was Donald J. Trump. 70% of the fact-checkable statements that he made in the 2016 campaign were either mostly or entirely false. And I would challenge James or Michael to even do that. If I said 70% of what you say today needs to be false, how would you even do that?
It takes the adoption of a fairly curious mindset to be able to do that, doesn't it?
Well, and it's not done by accident. His first 2 acts on Inauguration Day was to lie about the size of the inaugural crowd, an obvious lie because anyone could look at the picture, and to lie about whether it rained, another obvious lie because anyone could see that umbrellas had gone up. Why would you do that? Well, the answer is, the point here is not to deceive people, it's to confuse people and exert sovereignty over truth. From now on, I say something one day, you believe it, I say the opposite the next day, you believe that too. Over the course of his presidency, he's clocked at 30,000 plus lies by fact checkers. That's about 20 a day. And this all ramps up to the granddaddy of them all, the most audacious, sophisticated, and successful disinformation operation ever run against the American public. And that's the election lie, the Stop the Steal campaign. Now, this has proven devastatingly effective. 2/3 of Americans think the election was stolen. It certainly was not. We come now to James's point about Twitter. So there is this idea that social media is a marketplace of ideas. The less regulated, the better. I wish that were true, but it's not. The opposite is true. What social media becomes, if it's got no structure, is a race to the bottom, where people get clicks by posturing, by trolling, by lying, and that happens really quite quickly. Any of these systems needs an epistemic constitution. It needs some certain rules and guidelines and forms of behavior.
I might suggest that it does have an epistemic constitution. It's just not a productive one. So you say it needs some structure. I think it has a structure, which is why it's like that. It's just a dysfunctional structure.
It has algorithms. I wouldn't call that a structure, though.
But there's a structure to the way in which people interact. For example, they're motivated by getting likes, and they're motivated by getting lots of followers. And that's the motivations of the individual users. But again, that plays out across the network of users and creates a certain dynamic, which in this case is very much counter to the constitution of knowledge.
I think the ease with which you're able to retweet things on Twitter or X, I think, is also really key. I think other social media sites have been on, like Instagram, for example. It doesn't seem as easy to do that. And because of that, little messages don't go viral in the same way, and they don't build up the same kind of momentum of outrage.
Well, what Twitter was trying to do, it's very difficult. It's wicked hard. was try to figure out ways to regulate the system so that it would be more oriented to truth and more reliable for its users. Because, having people log on and learn that getting vaccinated means Bill Gates will install a microchip, ultimately that's not a safe and reliable product that people will buy. So they were blundering in their efforts to do this because it's a very hard problem, but they were trying to establish some rules and norms and gatekeepers. They were using things like interstitial warnings. So if a tweet went out that looked like it might be misinformation, you could watch it, but you might get some kind of tag that said this has been disputed. Or if you tried to retweet something without reading it, without going to the link that you're retweeting, you get an interstitial warning which says, are you sure you don't want to read this first? And these were efforts to slow people down, to make them think a little harder, to perhaps dull a little bit, Michael, what you rightly call incentives, that were driving the whole system into a state of chaos. And then along comes Elon Musk. And he says he fires most of the trust and safety team. He gets rid of most of these rules. He's got a model in his head of a marketplace of ideas, but in fact, it turns out that what these social media are really like is the Roman Colosseum, which is a whole bunch of spectators with blood sport of people down there in the field posturing against each other, attempting to slay each other and get attention.
The crowd is involved in the fight.
Yes.
They're actually participating. So, yes.
So you brought something up that I think is really important, because I think I actually prefer X. And I say that because I think that there were more rules in the past, but my perception at least was that some of the rules actually did sort of violate free speech in certain ways. For example, I think that in the past people could be thrown off the platform for misgendering. And I know that's a difficult conversation about whether that, how big a faux pas that should be, but I would say that that's covered by free speech. So, I guess the big question I have for you is just this, that I know exactly what you're trying to say with this idea that checks and balances of various sorts are important to sort of structure the conversation and sort of help us get at truth rather than just shouting at one another. However, it is possible that these checks and balances become too strong, right? So I feel the same way about the phrase misinformation, because a lot of the time when people talk about misinformation, I agree that with examples that you've given, certainly, Bill Gates is installing microchips through the vaccine. That seems completely false and pointless. But it strikes me as a kind of slippery slope. That's what people who want to clamp down on free speech always say, right? That this is obviously false, so people shouldn't be allowed to say it. So how do you balance the free speech side and the side of wanting to kind of regulate this conversation to make it more epistemically wholesome?
This is why I say it's a wicked hard problem. The printing press, by the way, was also a wicked hard problem, and it took 150 years of brutal warfare to sort that one out. I hope we don't do that again. So what these organizations were trying to reach for and trying to figure out, and did not succeed because it's so hard, but, for example, not relying on takedowns, but instead relying on disamplification, which is making some distinctions that slow certain kinds of information down. So you could see it, you could put it up there, but it might be on page 2 of the search results instead of page 1, for example. The notion became there's a right to freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Do you really want algorithms that are simply tuned so that all they're noticing is what gets clicks, regardless of the truth value, regardless of the consequences? So they were looking for ways to tweak the algorithms so that, for example, a statement that's been repeatedly fact-checked is true might come back higher in a search result or might be higher in someone's feed. And I mentioned things like interstitial warnings. Do you really want to retweet this without reading? Just to slow people down, make them think a bit. It turns out that, according to Facebook, just demoting a post to a little less high than it was can significantly slow down information that fact-checkers say is false. Now, some people might say that's a restriction of their rights. And I'd say, well, no, not really. There's going to be an algorithm one way or another. So why should we tune the algorithm to give the most velocity to the stuff that's least true?
Another big question is, well, who gets to decide, whose views go the farthest and whose views are false and undesirable, right? That's another big...
If we have fact checkers, you could see them as an institution within the constitution of knowledge. Do we trust them? What's their credentials for checking facts. I mean, perhaps they're great and perhaps they're not. I really don't know how it works, but
well, they're imperfect, but there are organizations now all around the world. They are journalistic organizations. They are fact-check organizations. They began in the United States in the first decade of the century, or maybe the 1990s. I think PolitiFact was the first. And they are imperfect, but they have a code of conduct in the classic manner of Constitution of Knowledge stuff, do's and don'ts. They are certified by an association which inspects them every year. They have codes of conduct. For example, show your work. Don't just say true or false. Go through every step of how you verified it, who you talk to. They sometimes say just true or false, but often they will say partly true, and so forth and so on. So what Google tried and what Facebook has tried to do is include fact-check ratings in their algorithmic presentation so that if something consistently comes through as that's a true statement, it might appear higher in the listings. Now that seems to me it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but it's probably better than a system in which, for example, African-American voters in the United States are confronted with a targeted campaign on social media. Don't forget to vote on Wednesday, when in fact the election was on Tuesday. That's a toxic environment, not only for the user, but it's a terrible business model.
Yeah.
People will flee from epistemically polluted situations where what they're getting is not reliable, where it's dangerous to them. So even if nothing else, and regardless of what Elon Musk may think, even if nothing else, these organizations, just as a business matter, are going to have to make discrimination in order to make their products usable.
The terrifying prospect is actually that for some of them it might be good for business just to play into people's priors, right? People probably quite like the idea that they're going to log onto the computer and everyone's going to be a conservative or everyone's going to be a progressive, right?
Yes. Of course.
That's obviously not what we want for society. I was wondering, what do you think of the Twitter or X community notes then, which are these kinds of warnings, but they're actually created by users in general or some subset of users rather than by...
So yeah, I like that model, and I also like the models that decentralize. So you can have different communities with different moderating procedures and different standards and different priorities. You see that on Reddit, for example. Part of the problem with the giant social media platforms is that there's so few of them. I'm guessing that we'd all agree that if there were a lot of different choices and none of them were quite as large, maybe we'd lose some utility, but we'd gain a lot more choice. So I think the community notes model is promising. There are also conversations about, well, what if users could apply their own filters, decide for themselves what their algorithms should look like on Facebook or X. Of course, some people would want to have screaming idiocy all day long, but I suspect a lot of people would apply filters in an intelligent way. Unfortunately, these companies don't let us do that. We have to use their algorithms, and they won't tell us really what they're doing. So we've got a black box situation. But the broader point of all of this is that we have a lot more choices between just showing us the stuff that is most viral, regardless of truth and harm, on the one hand, and censorship and a board of people taking down anything they don't like or agree with on the other. There's a whole range of intermediate options. And the goal here is to try to figure out how to begin to regulate and self-regulate with a system of norms and guidelines that makes some sense.
Yeah. I'd like to turn to another issue in relation to free speech, and this is really, I think, harking back to the Kindly Inquisitors, and I think this is a quote from that book. You said, I think, that we need to cultivate the hard self-discipline which requires us to live with offence. And of course, offence is often an objection to free speech, particularly at the moment. And I think one of your three categories of the sort of enemies of free speech was the humanitarians who believe that we need to be kind to everybody all the time. And so if you're offending somebody, then you really shouldn't say that. But as you've said many times, and others have said many times, we can't actually explore the truth without risking offending people, because if you say something that they disagree with, especially if it's a deeply held belief, they're going to be offended. And so we need to cultivate the ability to wear a fence and proceed anyway to have a good faith argument and discussion. And it seems to me, and this again touches on Jonathan Haidt's work, that young people in particular, we haven't done a good job of preparing them to live with offence, or to cultivate that self-discipline of experiencing offence and still being able to participate in a conversation. I was invited to sit on a free speech panel at the university up the hill a couple of months ago, and I'm not sure if you've heard about...
This would be Victoria?
At Victoria University, and there was a bit of a fight about it because some of the students and others objected to the presence of... In fact, I think Jonathan Ayling, particularly on the panel, who's the leader of the Free Speech Union, and they made claims about him that I think are completely false. But setting that aside, there was an article that appeared in the student newspaper Salient that said the real problem with having this panel in an open area of the university is that students might inadvertently walk by and hear something that was offensive to them, and that can never be undone, was the claim. So even merely hearing, say, Jonathan Ayling arguing in favour of free speech could do terrible harm to young people.
Just think of the harm he's doing all across the country.
I know. And we do every time we have an episode. I mean, this is, to me, terribly disturbing. And I don't blame it on young people, because they've been brought up the way they've been brought up, and educated or miseducated the way they have been. It is, in fact, a failing of the institutions that you've discussed, in particular education and perhaps even parenthood. And I think, Jonathan Haidt has blamed overly risk-averse parenting, as well as social media and its dynamics, which you've already discussed. It seems to me we need to really have a focus on building the robustness of young people to ideas that don't appeal to them.
Well, all of that I think is right. A few things are going on there. One is what I call in Kindly Inquisitors the humanitarian fallacy, which is that words are like bullets, because they may not hurt us physically, but they hurt us emotionally. They traumatize us. This is a violation of human rights. Well, the problem is words aren't like bullets. It's not like getting beaten over the head. Words are the foundation of criticism, and criticism, correcting someone's errors, telling them you're just wrong, can often be deeply offensive. But if you, Salman Rushdie said, without the right to offend, the freedom of speech ceases to exist, as does science, because science is all about the exchange of criticism. People are deeply offended in the sciences all the time. But and something else that's going on is a kind of therapeutic mindset. This is what Dr. Haidt and others have referred to, but that's the idea that the world should be emotionally safe, and that we shouldn't have to confront things that are quote unquote traumatizing, even if what the trauma consists of is being disturbed by an idea. And those things have come together to create the environment that you describe for many people. Still, it remains true that most young people actually enjoy hearing a good conversation or debate. And many of them want opportunities to do it. Surveys in the United States find that students on the left want to hear more from conservative viewpoints, not less. Goes back to what we said earlier about how small groups can dominate these environments by creating a false consensus. But I'm involved in a project in the United States which is super interesting. It's a project of a group called Braver Angels, which is a grassroots depolarizing network. It's in all 50 states. It's almost entirely volunteer. And they've got something they call Braver Angels Debates, which is a student-led parliamentary-style debate. You come as you are. You don't have to prepare. There are a few opening speeches. They deliberately choose hot-button topics like resolved. Students and professors should be allowed to carry guns on campus, for example. And it's a structured debate. The structure is always the key, as in the constitution of knowledge. So you can't address anyone else's you. You can only address the chair. And the speeches are timed, but it's a truth-seeking debate. There's no winner or loser. You can argue both sides or neither if you want. And what this does is give people an opportunity to express themselves in a structured way that feels like it's actually safe.
Yeah.
And that's got enough support and structure so that they walk away feeling, wow, I can do this. Students absolutely love it, and it's taking off in campuses around the country. And the point here, the broader point is, you're absolutely right, Michael. You don't just throw people into a university environment and say, have at it, have a thick skin, start arguing. There's a lot of training that goes into that, a lot of inculcation, and that's the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. Actually, I had a similar experience in my last couple of years at the university, where I was involved in setting up and running a program for students who had not met the grade in terms of university admission, but this was a kind of backdoor way, and if they completed this course along with one other selected course, they could enroll as full-time students. And as part of this, we did something similar, which was to sit them in a circle and introduce a topic with, again, a similar structure. And we placed a continuum on the floor, and they all had a token on that continuum according to how, at the beginning of the discussion, they felt how much they agreed with a particular proposition. And they were free to get up and move that token at any time during the conversation. And again, we had rules of, like, you don't say nasty things about one another, just stick to talking about the idea. And we were pretty careful at first because we thought,
this could go very wrong.
This could go very wrong. So we introduced relatively uncontroversial, or at least not hot button topics at first. And we ran it in one class, and we weren't intending it to do it in another, but at the end we debriefed with them. And they said, can we do this again? Only can we have more controversial ideas next time? And that was one of the most hopeful things that I've observed for a few years now in terms of...
This is found again and again. I heard from a professor who, because he used Kindly Inquisitors, my book, as a basis, is how I know about it, but he and another teacher at his university formed a class on handling controversial topics. They started with my book and laying some ground rules and building trust about how we talk to each other and how we criticize and the boundaries for that, and why you don't go after someone personally and you don't try to dominate by saying, as a person of color, I denounce you, and that sort of thing. And then once they've built that in the first few classes, they take on a series of the most controversial issues that they can find and escalating controversy. They do gender, for example, transgender. And the students absolutely love it. They responded very strongly. Once they had that element of trust, that those rules would be supportive of them and that they were not on the line for being shunned, ostracized forever and mobbed on social media, they responded exactly as you described. And huge demand for this. So this makes me quite hopeful, actually, that with more and better instruction, that there's a lot of room to reintroduce into university life, and for that matter, in secondary school life.
Well, I've thought that it could go right back to primary school with even 5-year-olds, obviously not discussing ideas in a complex way, but even just observing that different children like different flavors of ice cream.
Well, funny you should say that. There's another thing starting in the United States. Again, this is all pretty embryonic, but I think very promising. It's called debate-centered instruction. And here the idea, this starts in what we call middle school. This would be, the 10-year-olds to 14-year-olds. But instead of, assigning student to read something and give a solo report, you have a proposition. And the proposition might be something simple like, resolved, a hot dog is a sandwich. And then the students would take different sides of this issue, and they would work in teams to develop their arguments, and they would present those arguments. And then you could move on to other topics. But this can be actually integrated into instruction in really almost any course you think of. So instead of giving the report, you have a debate. And again, it's found that students really enjoy this. They sink their teeth into it. And an advantage of this topic is you're not necessarily defending the side you actually believe. You find you have to defend the other side and give it its best shot. And that's what makes the light bulb go on. Ah, I see. There are arguments on both sides, and I've got to understand the other side's argument. So there's a lot that can be done in the pedagogical world if we start to focus on it.
Yeah.
All right, that's a very hopeful note to end on, actually. And I'm afraid we will have to end now because you've got some other appointments for the good work you're doing around the country. So thanks very much for sharing some of your knowledge and insight with us, Jonathan Rauch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.